I'd like to thank you the kind invitation. My great pleasure for me to be here. And I'd like to congratulate Dr. Ricardo Santos de Oliveira for this amazing event. I will talk about a little bit about endoscopic anatomy of the ventricles. From a point of view of the rigid neuroendoscopy as OI system and another great system, the GAB system. These both systems allowed us to perform the procedures using both hands, a free hands technique, and the two main points for the ventricular approach as the Cocker point in adults and the transfontanelar approach in newborns. The main regions of the ventricles we can see is this. Most of the part of lateral ventricle, frontal horn, body and atrium, foramen of Monroe, and the majority of the parts of the third ventricle, except the roof of the third ventricle. After the entrance inside the lateral ventricle, the first view we can see is the region of the foramen of Monroe. It's a very important structure because it's a gate for the entrance inside the third ventricle. The main structures at this region is the anterior septal vein here, the superior thalamus-striate vein here. Both venous structures comprise the venous angle, very important because it's situated always at the posterior border of the foramen of Monroe. Between the both venous structures, we have the choroid plexus here. The superior and anterior border of the foramen of Monroe is the column of the fornix, and the laterally to foramen of Monroe here we have the septum pellucidum. In front, at the lateral situation, we have the head of the caudate nucleus here. Looking for the front, at the frontal horn, the main view we can see is this, the frontal horn. The superior part of the frontal horn is the genome of the corpus callosum. Here is the white structures, always. Medially, we can see here the septum pellucidum, and laterally, you can see the final part of the head of the caudate nucleus, here. In a posterior view, we can see the septum pellucidum. These structures is the majority parts is the avascular structures, few vessels inside the septum pellucidum. And the case of the chronic hydrocephalus, we can see always the fenestrated septum pellucidum. A more posterior view, we can see the atrium of the ventricle. The atrium, it's the posterior part of the septum pellucidum. Here we can see the posterior septal vein here, the final part of the choroid plexus towards the temporal horn, the bulb of the corpus callosum here, calcaraves here is the internal projection of the visual system at the occipital lobe, and the collateral eminence here. Through the foramen of Monroe, we can see the floor of the third ventricle. It's a very, very important region because the most of the endoscopic procedures are performed at the anterior region of the floor of the third ventricle. It's very important to know the main regions of the floor of the third ventricle. We can see here this very important scheme, the main parts, infundibular recess, It's very important to know. The mammillary bodies here, very important. And the posterior commissure here is the main structure to enter inside the cerebral aqueduct. So, a view through the foramen of Monroe, we can see this. We can see all the parts of the floor of the third ventricle. So we have an anterior part here, the region of the mammillary bodies. We have a middle part, commonly, not always, but the presence of the interthalamic adhesion. And the posterior part is the region of the entrance of the cerebral aqueduct, and laterally we have the posterior commissure. Focus our attention at the anterior part of the floor of the third ventricle. We can see these important structures to perform the mainly endoscopic approach for the third ventricle is the endoscopic third ventriculostomy. We can see here the main structures, mammillary bodies here and here. Tuber cinereum, it's a triangular part, it's a membrane triangular part, and laterally we have the hypothalamus and hypothalamus. The more anterior part of this region is the infundibular recess here. The same you can see here, a right mammillary body, left mammillary body. Tuber cinereum is the triangular part, tuber cinereum. Laterally, we have right hypothalamus, left hypothalamus, infundibular recess here, and below the tuber cinereum, we can see the top of basilar artery here, and its bifurcation. Cerebral posterior artery here, cerebral posterior artery here, and the third cranial nerve here. One more anterior projection of the endoscope. We can see here the infundibular recess here, and this triangular portion is the optic chiasm here. And more anteriorly, this membrane is the lamina terminalis. This more panoramic view, we can see here the infundibular recess, optic chiasm here. Laterally, we can see the hypothalamus here, and here the anterior structure is the lamina terminalis, and this panoramic view allows us to see this white structure is the anterior commissure. This is a video showing the importance of this region, showing the endoscopic third ventriculostomy. It's coagulation of the tuber cinereum, opening, dilatation of the tuber cinereum with the Fogarty balloon number 3. Below you can see the dorsum of the sella, basilar artery. This is the standard endoscopic third ventriculostomy. It's very important to know that below the anterior part of the floor of the third ventricle, we can see here the Liliequist membrane. Liliequist membrane has three parts, a cellular part, and the cellular part divides in two parts, and the diencephalic part below the mammillary bodies and the mesencephalic part here. The structures, the systems above the mesencephalic part of the liquids, these two parts, 1 and 2, is the interpeduncular system. And below the mesencephalic part of the liquids, this region is the prepontine system here. So, a panoramic view of this region, we can see this. The diencephalic portion of liquids here, just above the top of basilar artery and its division in the cerebral posterior artery here and superior cerebral artery here. And more inferiorly, we can see here the mesencephalic portion of the liquids. More inferior at the level of mesencephalic part of liquids here, we can see the basilar artery here, the ICA, anterior inferior cerebral artery, and the sixth nerve, abducens nerve here. One more inferior view, we can see the foramen, magnum foramen here, the bulb, the vertebral artery, in this case the left vertebral artery, a pica artery here, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the hypoglossus nerve here. Several fibers of the hypoglossus nerve, and here the clivus towards the magnum foramen. The middle part of the third ventricle, the main structure, is the interthalamic adhesion. You can see here the interthalamic adhesion, more common in children than in chronic hydrocephalus in adults. The posterior part of the third ventricle, we can see here. The main structures is the entrance of the cerebral aqueduct. Laterally, we can see the posterior commissure, and laterally, we can see the pineal recess here. A more superior view, we can see here the posterior commissure, the pineal recess here. At the bottom of the recess, we can see here the pineal gland here, and the habenullar commissure here, contouring the habenullar commissure here. Another panoramic view here, posterior commissure, pineal recess, pineal gland, habenular commissure, habenular triangle here, suprapineal recess here. A panoramic view of the roof of the third ventricle, we can see here the posterior commissure, pineal recess, pineal gland, habenula, suprapineal recess, and the roof of the third ventricle. It's a region with the presence of the choroid plexus also. So this is discussed on my two books, Atlas of Endoscopic Neurosurgery of the Third Ventricle and the Endoscopic Third Ventriculostomy. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd like to thank you again for the kind invitation. Thank you so much.